The heat in Savannah doesn't just sit on you, it weighs you down, thick with the scent of ancient oaks and the cloying aroma of expensive expectations. I stood on the gravel path of the estate at Rose Hill, the stones shifting under my navy heels with a sharp, rhythmic click that sounded far more confident than I felt. After a 6-hour flight from Seattle, and a lifetime of being the difficult daughter, I had convinced myself that today would be different. I was wearing a dress I'd spent a month's salary on, carrying a gift that contained 4 months of my architectural expertise, and for once, I thought I'd finally earned my place at the table. Then I saw my mother. Eleanor Vance stood framed by the barn's massive double doors, a fortress of champagne silk and perfectly coiffed hair. She didn't move toward me, she didn't open her arms. As I approached, her jaw set into a line of concrete. I recognized from every childhood correction. She stepped forward, not to greet me, but to barricade the entrance. The air around her smelled of Estee Lauder and cold finality. Athena, Jolene, she corrected herself, her voice a low, controlled whisper that cut deeper than any shout. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here for my sister's wedding, Mom," I said, the gift box suddenly feeling like a lead weight in my hands. She didn't blink. She didn't look at the sweat beading on my forehead or the hope I was trying so hard to hide. She leaned in, her eyes flicking to the Montgomery family, the local shipping tycoons who were mingling just feet away inside the golden glow of the barn. "You need to leave," she hissed. "This is a private event. Only family is allowed inside, and you weren't invited." The world tilted. I looked past her shoulder and saw my father, Arthur, standing in the shadows, his hands deep in his pockets, refusing to meet my eyes. He was a man who had spent 30 years choosing the path of least resistance, and today, that path involved erasing his eldest daughter. They stood there, the guardians of a perfect family image, blocking me from a celebration I had literally built for them. They saw an embarrassment. They saw an outsider. What they chose to forget, as I stood there in the stifling Georgia sun, was the digital trail I'd left in my wake. They forgot that every floral arrangement, every ounce of seared salmon, and the very roof over their heads today existed only because of my signature. They treated me like a distant relative, but in 3 days, they would realize that I was the only person who held the keys to the $53,500 debt they were about to inherit. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 27% right now, right? If that's true, type 8. If not, type 9. Let's see whether I got it right. All right. Enough talking. Let's begin the story. My name is Jolene Vance, and for 29 years, I played a role I never auditioned for, the invisible foundation. As a senior architect in Seattle, I spend my days calculating load-bearing walls and ensuring that massive structures don't collapse under their own weight. It's a bitter irony, really. I can spot a hairline fracture in a skyscraper from a mile away, yet I remained willfully blind to the rot eating through the foundation of my own family tree in Savannah. Before I reveal how that $53,500 bill became my official declaration of independence, please take a moment to subscribe. If you've ever been treated like a convenient resource rather than a daughter, the one they only call when the pipes burst or the credit cards max out type, I know my worth in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only one who had to build her own seat at the table. Growing up in that moss-draped corner of Georgia, the hierarchy was thicker than the local humidity. There was Clementine, our golden child, and then there was me, the contingency plan. My sister didn't just live, she performed. She was the one in the velvet dresses, the one whose choreographed laughter was the constant soundtrack to my parents' social ambitions. I was the quiet girl with the drafting pencil, tucked away in a cramped bedroom that frequently doubled as the laundry folding station. While Clementine was getting upgraded to a suite with a walk-in closet for her 10th birthday, I was hunched over a thrift store desk under a flickering fluorescent bulb that gave me chronic migraines. Eleanor and Arthur Vance didn't value resilience or genuine achievement. They worshipped the appearance of prosperity. Clementine gave them that in spades. When she decided she wanted to attend a prestigious art school to find her muse, they refinanced the family home to fund her tuition without a second thought. When I told them I had been accepted into the architecture program at the University of Washington, my father didn't offer a hug. He handed me a stack of student loan brochures and told me I was sturdy enough to figure it out. So, I did. I moved 3,000 miles away to Seattle and built a life that didn't require their permission. But the poison of being the lesser sibling runs bone deep. You spend years convincing yourself that if you just achieve more, if you just provide more, they'll finally look at you with the same warmth they reserve for her. I became the family's secret fixer. I was the one Eleanor called to review their failing credit reports, or to wire $1,000 for a temporary shortfall that always seemed to coincide with Clementine's latest luxury getaway. I accepted it because I genuinely believed that loyalty was a debt that could eventually be paid off. I didn't realize that in my mother's ledger, I wasn't a person. I was an interest-free loan, with no expiration date. The foundation of my invisibility wasn't poured in a single day. It was laid brick by brick throughout a childhood where my only purpose was to serve as the scaffolding for Clementine's spotlight. In our house on Forsyth Park, there were two types of reality: the one Eleanor curated for the neighbors, and the one I lived in the shadows. I remember the summer I turned 14, the year Eleanor decided Clementine needed a creative sanctuary to foster her burgeoning interest in watercolor. Without asking, my mother moved my drafting table, the one I'd saved 3 summers of lawn mowing money to buy, into the windowless laundry room. My bedroom, the one with the decent light and the view of the oaks, was annexed into Clementine's new suite. "You're the sturdy one, Joe," Eleanor had said, her voice like warm honey over a sharp blade. "Clementine is a delicate soul. She needs the environment to create. You can work anywhere." I spent the rest of my high school years hunched over that desk in the laundry room, the rhythmic thumping of the dryer vibrating through my spine as I calculated angles and studied blueprints. I became a ghost in my own home, a line item that was only acknowledged when there was a mess to clean or a debt to settle. I was the daughter who stayed up until 2:00 a.m., helping Clementine finish her art projects so she wouldn't lose her spark, only to watch my parents beam with pride as they framed her work on the mantel. My own straight-A report cards were met with a distracted, "That's nice, Joe," before the conversation inevitably shifted back to Clementine's latest lead role in a community play. The pattern was absolute. There is a specific kind of trauma in being the child who is never rebellious enough to be noticed, but never special enough to be celebrated. I grew up believing that my value was tied directly to my utility. I was the reliable one, the one who handled the grocery lists when Eleanor had her migraines, and the one who tutored Clementine through every math class she nearly failed. My father, Arthur, would sit at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the evening news, a silent witness to this slow erosion of my identity. He never intervened. He simply adjusted his glasses and chose the peace of my silence over the conflict of my protection. By the time I left for Seattle, I didn't just carry a suitcase. I carried a profound, bone-deep conviction that if I just worked hard enough and paid enough, I might finally earn a seat at the table that wasn't next to the trash. I was wrong. In Savannah, some people aren't built to be family. They are built to be architects of your own disappearance. In Savannah, prestige is a currency more valuable than cash, and my mother, Eleanor, had spent her entire life trying to amass a fortune of it. To her, the Montgomery name wasn't just a family, it was a sanctuary. The Montgomerys owned half the docks and a third of the warehouses in the region, their influence stretching back through generations of shipping manifests and debutante balls. Wyatt Montgomery, the youngest son and Clementine's fiancé, was a man of quiet, understated wealth, the kind that doesn't need to shout because everyone is already listening. He was polite, traditional, and possessed a moral compass that Eleanor found both useful and terrifying. My mother's strategy for the wedding was an architectural feat of deception. She needed Wyatt's mother, Margaret Montgomery, to believe that the Vances were their social and financial equals, a unified front of Southern grace and stability. But the reality was a structure riddled with termites. Behind the closed doors of our house on Forsyth Park, my father, Arthur, was drowning in the fallout of a series of failed local investments. They had recently refinanced the family home for the third time just to keep up with the country club dues and Clementine's art school supplies, which mostly consisted of designer handbags and trips to Tulum. They were house poor in the most literal sense, living in a gilded cage they could no longer afford to maintain. I was the inconvenient truth in Eleanor's master plan. A daughter who lived 3,000 miles away, who worked 60-hour weeks in a gritty Seattle firm, and who refused to adopt the soft, submissive Southern belle persona Eleanor had sold to the Montgomerys. To Margaret Montgomery, my mother had painted a picture of a small, tight-knit family: Eleanor, Arthur, and their one precious jewel, Clementine. My independence wasn't seen as a success, it was a flaw in the design, a variable Eleanor couldn't control. This was why my signature was the ultimate irony. The very person Eleanor wanted to hide was the only person with the credit-worthiness to fund the lie. As I sat in my office in Seattle months ago, signing digital contracts for the $62,000 celebration, I thought I was being the strong big sister Eleanor always asked me to be. I didn't realize I was actually paying for the hammer that would eventually be used to nail the door shut in my face. I was the secret bankroll for an elite performance, where I wasn't even allowed to be a member of the audience. I remember the exact moment the structural integrity of my relationship with my parents began to fracture, though I was too blinded by a sense of duty to see the cracks. It was a rainy Tuesday in Seattle, 3 months before the wedding. I was in the middle of a high-stakes project review for a new tech headquarters when my phone buzzed. It was Eleanor. She didn't call to ask about my life or my promotion. She called with a voice that had been carefully tuned to a frequency of desperate, motherly distress. "Joe," she had sobbed, the sound of Forsyth Park humidity practically dripping through the receiver. "Arthur's credit is still bruised from that property mess last year. The estate at Rose Hill. They won't finalize the booking without a primary guarantor who has established liquid assets. If we don't fix this by Friday, Clementine loses her dream. She'll be devastated." She didn't ask for a loan. She asked for my professional endorsement. She framed it as a technicality, a simple signature on a series of DocuSign links that would hold the dates until the wedding gifts and Arthur's pending dividends arrived. I sat at my mahogany desk, surrounded by blueprints of skyscrapers that were designed to withstand earthquakes, and yet I couldn't withstand the tremors in my mother's voice. I opened the links. Meadow Creek Barn, Southern Comfort Catering, the florist, the photographer. It was a $62,000 performance. My mother's name was on the contact line, but my social security number and my hard-earned Seattle credit score were the only things keeping the roof from falling in. "It's just a formality, honey," she whispered. "You're the anchor of this family. We just need you to steady the ship." I authorized the $8,500 initial deposit that afternoon, believing I was finally buying my way back into their hearts. But as soon as the digital ink dried, the architecture of my isolation became apparent. Within 48 hours, I was accidentally dropped from the Montgomery Vance wedding crew group chat. Clementine would forward me photos of $3,000 bridesmaid dresses with a flippant, "Vote Joe." But when I asked about the rehearsal dinner or my role in the ceremony, the line went cold. "We're just so swamped, big sis," she'd text 3 hours later. "Mom has it handled. Just stay focused on your big city projects." I was the silent partner in a firm that was systematically erasing my name from the letterhead. I was paying for the invitations I hadn't received and funding the toasts I wouldn't be allowed to hear. Every time a new invoice hit my inbox for approval, I felt a surge of pride that I was strong enough to carry them. I didn't realize I wasn't an anchor. I was a sacrificial pylon, driven deep into the dark mud of their vanity so that they could walk across me without ever getting their shoes dirty. I was signing off on my own disappearance, one $10,000 catering rider at a time, never suspecting that the family I was saving was already drafting a blueprint that didn't include a room for me. The air in Savannah during October is deceptive. It feels like a heavy, wet blanket draped over your skin, smelling of gardenias and the slow rot of the marshes. I stood there, my heels sinking deeper into the expensive gravel path of the estate at Rose Hill, clutching the gift box that contained months of my architectural labor. My mother, Eleanor, remained a rigid barricade in her champagne silk, her eyes darting nervously toward the interior of the barn where the sounds of Pachelbel's cannon were just beginning to drift through the rafters. The sheer audacity of her, "You weren't invited," was still ringing in my ears like a sudden loss of cabin pressure. Then, the heavy oak doors creaked open further, and Margaret Montgomery stepped out into the afternoon light. Margaret was the living blueprint of Savannah's old guard, tall, silver-haired, draped in lavender lace and pearls the size of blueberries. She carried herself with the terrifying grace of a woman who had never had to check her bank balance or apologize for her existence. She looked at Eleanor, then her gaze drifted to me, taking in my navy dress and the way I was standing there like a trespasser at my own family's celebration. "Eleanor, dear." Margaret's voice was a smooth, southern drawl that sounded like honey poured over dry ice. "Is everything all right? The ceremony is about to begin. Is this one of the bridesmaids?" I saw it then, the exact microsecond Eleanor Vance had to choose between her daughter's dignity and the preservation of her carefully constructed facade. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even flinch. She pasted on a smile so bright and brittle it looked like it might shatter if the wind changed direction. "Oh, Margaret, no," my mother laughed, a high, tinkling sound that didn't reach her cold eyes. "This is just a distant relative from out of state. She got her dates mixed up and stopped by to drop off a gift before she heads to the airport." So sweet, but so confused. A distant relative? Margaret tilted her head, her sharp eyes studying my face with a curiosity that made my skin crawl. "I was under the impression you only had one daughter, Eleanor, just our lovely Clementine." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a skyscraper. I looked past Eleanor's silk-covered shoulder and caught sight of my father, Arthur. He was standing just inside the shadow of the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to shrink into the wood grain. He looked down at his polished black shoes, a silent witness to my erasure. He knew I had authorized the $8,500 deposit from my Seattle account just 3 weeks ago. He knew I was the one who had stayed up until dawn, redrafting the site plans when the florist complained about the layout. And yet, he stood there like a post, refusing to offer even a flicker of recognition. "I have just the one," Eleanor confirmed, her voice steady and honey-warm as she tucked a stray hair behind Margaret's ear. "You know how large these southern families can be, cousins of cousins. It's hard to keep track." I felt a cold, clinical clarity wash over me, the kind I usually reserve for a structural failure on a job site. As Margaret nodded and led my mother back inside, the barn doors swung shut, leaving me alone in the stifling heat with the dust and the silence. I wasn't just a daughter they were embarrassed of. I was a non-entity, a ghost with a high credit limit. They had spent 29 years teaching me that I was a line item of debt, but today, they had officially removed me from the ledger entirely. They thought they had successfully executed a perfect performance, but they had forgotten one fundamental rule of architecture. If you remove the primary support structure, the entire building is coming down. And I was done being the scaffolding for a family that didn't even know my name. The interior of my rental car felt like a sensory deprivation chamber after the humid violence of that encounter on the gravel. I sat there, the engine idling, the air conditioning blasting a cold, synthetic wind against my face that did nothing to cool the burning shame in my chest. Through the windshield, Meadow Creek Barn looked like a glowing lantern of southern hospitality, a postcard of a life I was no longer allowed to inhabit. I could hear the muffled, joyous swell of the string quartet as they transitioned into the recessional music. The ceremony was over. Clementine was now a Montgomery, and I was still a Vance, the Vance they had just buried in the backyard of their reputation. I pulled out my phone, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy. Part of me, the part that still lived in the windowless laundry room of my youth, was screaming that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Surely Clementine didn't know. Surely my little sister, the girl whose art projects I had stayed up until dawn to salvage, Wouldn't let our mother treat me like an uninvited trespasser. I sent a single text, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I'm at the gate. Mom just turned me away. She told Margaret Montgomery. I'm a confused cousin. Clementine, please tell me you didn't know about this. I watched the 3 dots appear almost instantly. She was there. She was holding her phone, probably while taking those perfect family portraits I'd soon see on social media. But she didn't text back. Instead, a voice memo notification popped up. I pressed play, and the silence of the car was shattered by a voice that sounded like spun sugar wrapped around a razor blade. Joe, honey, listen, Clementine began, her tone dripping with that practiced, performative sympathy she used when she wanted to soften a blow. I heard about what happened at the door. Mom told me she had to make a tough call, and honestly, I think she was right. This day is about the Montgomerys. Joe Wyatt's family is very traditional, very old Savannah. Trying to explain why my older sister lives 3,000 miles away and works in some gritty industrial office. It would have been a lot. It would have made things weird before the ink was even dry on the marriage certificate. She paused, and I could hear the faint clinking of champagne glasses in the background. We just didn't want any drama to overshadow the union. You understand, right? You've always been the sturdy one, the one who handles the hard stuff so I can have my moment. And seriously, thank you so much for lopping off that $8,500 deposit for the venue and the caterer. You're literally the best big sis. We'll do a quiet lunch or something next time you're in town if things aren't too busy. Love you. The memo ended with a soft click. I stared at the phone until the screen went black, reflecting my own ruined face back at me. The betrayal wasn't a crack in the foundation. It was the realization that the entire building was a hollow stage set. Clementine hadn't been coerced by Eleanor. She had signed off on my disappearance as a matter of social convenience. To her, I wasn't a sister. I was a line item of debt that had served its purpose. I had paid for the stage, I had built the scenery, and now that the curtain was up, I was being told to wait in the parking lot while they took the applause. My sister had just blessed my heart while picking my pocket, and for the first time in 29 years, the scaffolding of my loyalty finally collapsed. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. The Magnolia Inn had thin walls and a carpet that smelled faintly of lemon-scented floor wax and decades of temporary stays, but the silence inside room 212 was deafening. I sat cross-legged on the floral bedspread, still wearing the navy dress that was supposed to represent my triumphant return, and stared at my phone until the screen burned into my retinas. The voice memo from Clementine was a loop playing in my head, a sugary, razor-sharp reminder that my sturdiness was just a euphemism for being easy to exploit. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't scream. Instead, I watched the notifications roll in like a slow-motion car crash. A ping from Instagram signaled the arrival of the wedding carousel. There they were. 14 images of a life I had built, but wasn't allowed to inhabit. The first photo was the money shot, the 6 of them at the altar, under the eucalyptus garlands I'd authorized just last month. My mother in her silk, my father in his rented suit, Clementine and Wyatt, and the Montgomery elders. They looked like a dynasty, a unified front of Savannah's elite. The caption was the final nail in the coffin of my loyalty, surrounded by everyone who matters. Number Montgomery Vance, number Caldwell forever, number the only ones who matter. I felt a strange, clinical sensation, similar to the way I feel when I find a structural flaw in a blueprint that requires a total teardown. The hurt was still there, a dull ache behind my ribs, but it was being rapidly replaced by a terrifyingly clear sense of logic. I was the only person who had paid for the salmon they were currently eating. I was the only person not in those photos, and yet, I was the only person whose name was legally bound to the $53,500 that would be due by Thursday. I opened my laptop. The emails from Meadow Creek Barn, the caterer, and the florist were sitting in my inbox, cheerful and automated, Addressed to Athena Sinclair, the name my mother still used when she wanted my credit score, but didn't want my presence. I scrolled through the PDFs of the contracts I'd signed in my Seattle office, reading the fine print with the precision of a woman who writes technical documentation for a living. The contract holder maintains sole authority over payment authorization, the Meadow Creek document stated. A boundary isn't a weapon, it's a structural necessity. My family had spent years teaching me that I didn't exist unless I was paying for their comfort. They had turned me into a ghost at the gates of my own life. And now, that ghost was the only one holding the keys to their financial survival. I realized then that I had 4 days to decide whether I would continue to be the best big sis by funding a lie that erased me, or whether I would finally act like the senior architect I was and let the structure collapse under its own weight. I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolute. They wanted a wedding without drama? I was about to give them a reality check worth $53,500. The clarity didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It settled over me like the cold, clinical silence of a site inspection after a catastrophic failure. I opened my laptop, the screen's blue-white light illuminating the floral wallpaper of room 212, and I began the process of deconstructing the $62,000 stage I had built for my own execution. As an architect, I know that when a building is no longer safe for occupancy, you don't try to patch the cracks. You initiate a controlled demolition. My fingers were steady as I dialed the first number on the vendor list, Meadow Creek Barn. It was Sunday night, but in the world of high-end southern weddings, the managers are always on call. Meadow Creek, this is Julie. The voice was bright, still riding the high of a successful Saturday event. Julie, this is Jolene Vance. I am the primary contract holder and the sole guarantor for the Montgomery Vance wedding, I said, my voice dropping into the precise, low register I used when dealing with difficult contractors on a job site. Oh yes, Miss Vance. It was a stunning evening. We're preparing the final invoice for the remaining $14,000. Stop, I interrupted, the word clean and sharp as a scalpel. I am calling to formally notify you that I am withdrawing my payment authorization for the outstanding balance of $14,800. I was not present at the event. I did not receive the services rendered, and I am requesting that the invoice be redirected immediately to the event hosts at Forsyth Park, Eleanor and Arthur Vance. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. I didn't fill it with excuses or anger. Silence is a tool, and I let it do the work. Miss Vance. You're the signatory, Julie finally stammered. If you don't pay, the liability falls to the residents at that address. Precisely, I replied. I repeated the process 4 more times. The caterer, the florist, the photographer, and the string ensemble. Each call took less than 3 minutes. I didn't raise my voice once. I simply stated the fact. The distant relative they saw at the gate was the only person who had the legal authority to authorize the $38,000 remaining on their tab. The final step was the most definitive. I called my bank's fraud department and canceled the credit card linked to the contracts, ordering a replacement to be sent to my office in Seattle. By the time I hung up, the $53,500 debt was no longer my structural burden. I had officially removed the scaffolding. I sat back against the headboard, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, and realized that for the first time in 34 years, I didn't owe anyone a performance. My parents had told the world I didn't exist, and I had simply decided to make that a financial reality. The blue light of my laptop screen felt like a cold compress against the burning exhaustion of the day. In the silence of room 212, I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I expected after canceling the authorizations. Instead, I felt a profound, heavy sense of equilibrium. As an architect, I am trained to understand that a boundary isn't just a line on a piece of paper, it is a physical reality that dictates who is allowed inside a space and who is kept out. For 34 years, I had allowed my family to encroach upon my territory, treating my resources, my time, and my identity as their own personal annex. I opened a fresh email draft. My hands, which had been trembling for hours, were now as steady as if I were drafting the final specs for a multi-million-dollar skyscraper. I added Eleanor, Arthur, and Clementine to the recipient list. I didn't use Mom or Dad. Those titles are earned through protection and recognition, and tonight they had officially resigned from those positions. The email was clinical. It was the digital equivalent of a load-bearing wall being removed from a condemned building. I wrote, "This email serves as formal notification that I have removed my payment authorization from all vendor contracts associated with the event at Meadow Creek Barn. The outstanding balance of $53,500 has been redirected to you as the hosts. I have also canceled the credit card on file and disputed any pending charges made after 2:00 p.m. today." I paused, my cursor blinking like a heartbeat in the dark room. I thought about the Estee Lauder on Eleanor's skin and the way Arthur's shadow had shrunken in the doorway. I added one more paragraph, not out of anger, but for the sake of structural clarity. "Eleanor, you informed Margaret Montgomery today that I am a distant relative who is confused about the schedule. I am simply honoring that new design. Distant relatives do not sign $62,000 contracts for people they barely know. Clementine, you informed me via voice memo that my absence was, for the best, to avoid drama with your new family. I agree. A $53,500 debt is a significant piece of drama, and it is best that it remains with the people who actually attended the party." I hit send. The soft whoosh of the outgoing mail sounded like a sigh of relief. For the first time, I recognized what my therapist would later call functional over-responsibility. The frantic, bone-deep belief that if I just performed well enough, paid enough, and absorbed enough insults, I could force them to love me. I had been the scaffolding for a family that was actively trying to demolish me. By sending that email, I wasn't seeking revenge. I was reclaiming my own sight. I was taking back the $53,500 I had intended to spend on their happiness and investing it into my own freedom. The invoices were no longer my burden. The lie was no longer my secret. I sat back, watching the rain start to smear the streetlights outside the Magnolia Inn, and realized that while I might be out $8,500 in deposits, the clarity I had gained was worth every penny of the $53,500 I refused to pay. The structural collapse of the Vance reputation didn't happen in a single, explosive moment. It was a slow, agonizing subsidence, like a house built on marshland finally giving way to the tide. Bdziewięć, 0 a.m. On Monday, the quiet, moss-draped dignity of our family home on Forsyth Park was shattered by the rhythmic, demanding vibration of Eleanor's phone. The vendors, Julie from Meadow Creek, the catering manager, the florist were no longer the polite, deferential service providers who had spent months catering to my mother's whims. Without my payment authorization, they were simply creditors, and they were looking for a new guarantor. I heard the first wave of the fallout through Aunt Ruth, who called me from a park bench in Savannah while I was waiting for my return flight at the Nashville airport. Eleanor's first instinct, true to her design, was to pivot and play the victim. She had spent the morning calling the vendors, claiming I was going through a mental health crisis and that my withdrawal of funds was a symptom of instability. But in the world of high-end contracts, emotion is irrelevant. Only the signature carries weight. When Julie from Meadow Creek told her that the balance of $14,800 had to be settled by Thursday, or the account would be sent to a collection agency, my mother's voice reportedly lost its honeyed southern drawl and became something brittle and shrill. The second wave was more public. Aunt Ruth didn't wait for the gossip to find her. She went directly to the source of Eleanor's pride. Ruth called Margaret Montgomery, the woman Eleanor had spent 2 years trying to impress. Ruth didn't shout. She spoke with the clinical precision of a retired principal. She informed Margaret that the distant relative at the gate was actually the firstborn daughter who had funded every ounce of the $62,000 wedding. Margaret, a woman who built her own social empire on the bedrock of traditional values and integrity, did not take kindly to being a pawn in Eleanor's erasure of her own child. According to Ruth, The silence on Margaret's end was colder than a January frost. The fallout rippled through every load-bearing wall of my mother's social life. By Monday afternoon, the board chair of the Hope Foundation, the charity Eleanor lived for, received an anonymous tip regarding the Vance family's financial exploitation of their eldest daughter. In a town like Savannah, being house poor is a secret many families keep, but being exposed as a fraud who relies on a disowned daughter's credit to pay for salmon and eucalyptus is a social death sentence. Eleanor wasn't just losing $53,500, she was losing the currency of her own name. Clementine and Wyatt's honeymoon in street. Bart's was cut short by a series of frantic, panicked calls from Eleanor, demanding they take out a personal loan to cover the debt before the Montgomerys withdrew their social endorsement entirely. For the first time in 29 years, the Vance family wasn't performing for the neighbors. They were struggling to survive the demolition of their own architecture. Seattle greeted me with a soft gray drizzle that felt cleaner and more honest than the suffocating, perfumed heat of Savannah. I stood on the balcony of my apartment, breathing in air that didn't smell of Estee Lauder or ancient, rotting expectations. On the small cedar table behind me lay the leather-bound portfolio I had carried across the country, the gift Eleanor and Clementine never bothered to see. It wasn't just a set of blueprints, it was 4 months of my professional life, a vision for a dream home I had meticulously designed for a sister who didn't think I was family enough to stand at her altar. I didn't feel the urge to cry anymore. Instead, I felt a profound sense of equilibrium, as if a massive, unnecessary load-bearing wall had finally been removed from my chest, allowing the structure of my own identity to breathe for the first time in 29 years. I picked up the first page, the rendering of the master suite, and held it over a small metal basin. The flame from my lighter caught the edge of the heavy vellum, turning my unrequited sacrifice into gray ash and smoke. For my entire life, I had been the architect of my own disappearance, pouring my strength and my resources into the foundations of people who only saw me as a contingency plan. I had lost $8,500 in non-refundable deposits that weekend, but in the world of high-end design, we call that a sunk cost. It was the cheapest tuition I had ever paid for the realization that I am worth infinitely more than a seat next to the kitchen trash. Eleanor, Arthur, and Clementine are currently navigating the $53,500 ruins of their reputation in Savannah, but that is their construction project now, not mine. I have a new blueprint now, one where the door's controlled from the inside. I am Jolene Vance. I am a senior architect, a survivor of Forsyth Park, and finally, a woman who belongs at the head of her own table. If you've ever had to build your own table because no one offered you a chair, type table 1 in the comments. If you were me, would you have paid the $53,500 for the sake of peace, or would you have walked away to find your own freedom? I'm reading every response. Hit subscribe for more stories about finding your voice when the people closest to you try to silence it. Thank you for staying until the end. The price of a seat at the table. A lesson in sovereignty. The story of Jolene Vance isn't just about a wedding bill or a family spat in Savannah. It's a mirror reflecting a quiet crisis many of us carry in our bones. We often spend decades acting as the scaffolding for people who only notice our strength when we stop letting them lean on us. The most painful realization Jolene faced wasn't the $53,500 debt, but the truth about functional over-responsibility. Many of us are raised to believe that if we perform well enough, pay enough, and absorb enough silence, we can eventually earn the love we were supposed to receive for free. But love that requires you to disappear is not love, it's a transaction. Family should be a sanctuary, a foundation built on mutual recognition. When those who raised you begin to treat you as a line item or a contingency plan, the structure is already compromised. Jolene learned that setting a boundary is not an act of revenge. It is an act of architectural integrity. It is the moment you decide that your peace of mind is worth more than a seat at a table where you aren't truly seen. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is walk down that gravel path and not look back. The $53,500 $500 Jolene refused to pay wasn't just money, it was the ransom for her own soul. She realized that you don't owe your life to people who treat your existence as a social inconvenience. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to build your own table because the one you were born into didn't have a chair for you? If Jolene's story resonated with your own journey of setting boundaries, type table 1 in the comments. Would you have drawn the line as she did, or would you have paid the price for the sake of peace? If you found value in this story of resilience and self-worth, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share these deep slices of life every week to remind you that your voice matters, your boundaries are valid, and you are always worth the wait. Thank you for staying until the end.